the world tilted, a sickening lurch of gray water and splintered wood. She landed hard on her hands and knees, and the filthy water soaked the front of her thin tunic with an icy, biting shock. Laughter erupted around her, sharp and cruel as broken glass. "Look at that," a voice drawled, thick with amusement. Kyle, one of the pack's senior warriors, stood over her, a smirk twisting his lips. "The blank is so useless it can't even carry a bucket." A wave of chuckles followed, rippling through the pack hall like a disease. The name, blank. It didn't even sting anymore. Truth be told, it was just a fact. A truth she had swallowed so many times it had become part of her bones. She was Nora the Blank, the wolfless, the empty space where a person was supposed to be. Her heart hammered a dull, familiar rhythm of shame against her ribs. Because of that, she didn't even look up. She didn't speak. Instead, her body moved on instinct, her hands reaching for the rag at her belt. The rough fabric scraped against her skin as she began to sop up the spreading puddle. This was her purpose. This was her place. To be the mistake that made everyone else feel whole. The failure that made them feel strong. The silence stretched, thick with their contempt. With every heartbeat, she felt their eyes on her, a physical weight pressing her further into the cold, damp floor. Maybe it was fate that she was born this way, broken, defective. What was the point in fighting a destiny that was so clearly written?
At the same time, hundreds of miles away, King Draven stood alone in a chamber of cold, polished stone. The silence in his throne room was a roaring beast, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the grand hearth. A massive war map, a tapestry of mountains and rivers and blood-red markers lay sprawled across the table before him. Each marker was a life, a choice, a burden that was his and his alone. More importantly, it was a reminder of the unending, crushing weight of his crown. His council had just left, yet their voices, a cloying mix of flattery and ambition, still seemed to cling to the air like a bad scent. He stalked towards the high, arched window, his boots echoing in the unnerving quiet. He was a king, an alpha of alphas, a being of immense power, and he was utterly, profoundly alone. Deep down, he knew the truth. His power wasn't a bridge, it was a wall. A fortress of ice he had built around his own heart. He trusted no one, not after what happened to his parents, not after the betrayal that had seared his soul and thrust this cold, heavy crown upon his head. He stared out at the moon-silvered peaks that ringed his citadel. A kingdom of shadows and secrets. His kingdom. His prison. A weariness so deep it felt ancient settled over him. He had the power. He had the respect. He had the fear. But what was it all worth when his world was so empty? The silence roared, a hollow ache in his chest. And just like that, everything changed when the heavy doors of the Blackwood Pack Hall creaked open far away. The Alpha stepped forward, his voice booming with an announcement that would shatter both their worlds. A proclamation. The annual mating ceremony will be held in 3 nights' time. King Draven himself will be in attendance. A collective gasp sucked the air from the hall. The Alpha's eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, swept the room. They passed over Nora, a cruel, dismissive glint in them. Attendance is mandatory. For all. Before the words left his lips, Nora's heart plummeted into the icy puddle at her knees. A king. A mating ceremony. It wasn't a chance for hope. It was a guarantee of her ultimate public humiliation.
That night, Nora sat on the edge of her thin, lumpy mattress. The room was little more than a closet, cold and smelling of damp stone. In her hands, she held the dress she was expected to wear. It was a plain, gray slip of a thing, patched at the hem and faded from countless washes. It was a dress made for a shadow, a dress made for her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the memory from rising. It was a ghost, soft and warm and smelling of lavender and earth. Her mother. She saw her mother's hands, so much stronger and kinder than her own, holding up a bolt of deep blue fabric, the color of a twilight sky. "One day, my little wolf," her mother's voice whispered in her memory, a melody of love and promise. Your wolf will sing to the moon, and your mate will see you in a dress the color of midnight, and he will know he has found his queen. The memory shattered. A sob, hot and sharp, caught in her throat. Her wolf had never sung. It had never even whispered. And the only thing a mate would find in her was nothing. A void. A blank space where a soul was meant to be. Her chest ached with a grief so old it felt like part of her anatomy. She didn't know what scared her more, the public humiliation to come, or the tiny, traitorous spark of that little girl's hope that refused to be completely extinguished.
Meanwhile, in Silvermoon Keep, the doors to Draven's private study opened. His beta Lycan entered, his face a mask of grim duty. He was older, his face lined with the scars of 100 battles, but his eyes were sharp and fiercely loyal. Alpha. Lycan's voice was a low rumble. Word from the Blackwood Pack. They are ecstatic at the news of your attendance. Draven didn't turn from the window. Ecstatic. Of course they are. He finally turned, his own eyes like chips of gold in the firelight. Prepare the escort. We leave at dawn. Lycan hesitated, a rare sign of uncertainty from the stoic warrior. My king, are you certain about this? The timing is difficult, with the border skirmishes. It is because of the border skirmishes that I must go. Draven's voice was sharp, a whip crack in the quiet room. My presence reinforces loyalty, Lycan. It reminds these alphas where their allegiance lies. It is a show of strength, a reminder that my gaze is everywhere. I understand, Lycan nodded slowly. But the ceremony itself, it is a distraction. Another parade of simpering she-wolves, all vying for a crown they are not fit to wear. You have not shown interest in a mate for 10 years. And I have no interest now, Draven snapped, the words colder than the mountain wind. This is politics, nothing more. We will arrive, I will make my presence known, and we will leave. I will not be drawn into their petty dramas. To make things worse, he knew the council was pushing for a strategic alliance, a loveless union to produce an heir. The thought was like poison in his veins. His parents had a true mate bond, a love so powerful it was the stuff of legends. He would have that, or he would have nothing. And since the world had proven to be a place barren of such things, he expected nothing. His decision was made, a final, unshakable thing. The mating ceremony was a political necessity, a tedious duty he would perform before returning to the cold comfort of his war maps and his solitude. The moment their eyes locked in the firelight, Lycan knew there was no more room for argument. Yet as he bowed and left the chamber, a flicker of something, a premonition perhaps, stirred within him. As if the wind itself was shifting, carrying with it the scent of a storm that no map could ever predict. Before she could move, a she-wolf from her pack, Lyra, appeared in the doorway of Nora's tiny room, her lips curled in a sneer. Don't look so sad, Blank, she purred, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You never know. Maybe a blind rogue with no sense of smell might have you. Lyra's laughter followed her down the hall, sharp and ugly. And Nora? She just sat there, clutching the gray dress, as the last flickering ember of hope died within her, leaving only cold, dark ash.
The pack hall was a nightmare of sound and heat. Laughter, sharp and brittle, echoed off the stone walls. The air, thick with the scent of pine wine and roasting meat, felt heavy in her lungs, making it hard to breathe. Nora found a small alcove behind a tapestry, a pocket of shadow where she could disappear. Her goal was simple: become part of the stone. Cease to exist. With every heartbeat, the dread inside her grew, a cold, coiling serpent in her belly. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the preening she-wolves, their dresses like jewels, their laughter a confident, cutting melody. They were predators, and this was their hunting ground. She was nothing. And then, a hush fell over the hall, a silence so sudden, so complete, it was louder than all the noise that came before it. The great oak doors swung open, and the Alpha King entered. He was not a man. He was a storm. Tall and broad-shouldered, clad in black leather that seemed to drink the torchlight, He moved with a predatory grace that stole the breath from her lungs. Power radiated from him, a palpable force that bent the very air around him. His eyes, the color of molten gold, swept the crowd with a look of bored, absolute authority. Her breath caught, her world tilted. In that moment, her only thought was to sink deeper into the shadows, to pray that his gaze would pass over her, that he wouldn't see the broken, worthless thing hiding in the corner.
Draven walked into the hall and the familiar wave of scents and sounds washed over him. Duty. This was duty. A performance. He let his gaze drift over the assembled wolves, acknowledging their bowed heads with a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He saw the hopeful she-wolves, their scents cloying and sweet with ambition. He saw the nervous alphas, their minds churning with political calculations. It was all a tedious, predictable game. His goal was to endure it. But then, something shifted. A scent, unlike any other, cut through the noise. It wasn't the sweet perfume of the hopefuls or the earthy musk of the warriors. No, this was moonlight. It was winter ash and hidden earth and a spark of something ancient and wild. It was a song his soul had been waiting to hear its entire, lonely existence. As if pulled by a string, his eyes followed the scent. Past the rows of posturing alphas, past the shimmering dresses and hopeful faces, to a dark corner, to a shadow. And in that shadow was her, a slip of a girl in a faded gray dress, her head bowed, trying so desperately to be invisible. But she was the only thing in the entire world he could see. The air thickened. Time stood still. The bond, the fated, mythical, impossible mate bond, slammed into him like a physical blow, a bolt of lightning that set every nerve in his body on fire. Mine. The word was not a thought. It was a truth. It was the core of his being, a primal growl that echoed in the marrow of his bones. His body moved on instinct. He didn't decide to walk towards her. His feet simply carried him. The silence in the hall was absolute now, a shocked waiting thing. He heard the gasps. He felt the hundreds of stunned eyes on him. He didn't care. There was only the girl, only the scent, only the golden thread of fate pulling him home.
She felt his approach before she saw it. The air grew warmer, charged with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A scent, rich and wild, like a storm-swept forest, filled her senses. Her heart skipped. She risked a glance up from beneath her lashes and froze. He was coming. For her. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. Her thoughts spun. What had she done? Had she broken some unknown rule? Was he coming to punish her for her very existence in his presence? He stopped. Right in front of her. The sheer size of him blotted out the light from the hall, plunging her little alcove into an intimate twilight. He was so close she could see the flecks of darker gold in his eyes, the tense set of his jaw. He lifted a hand, slow, deliberate. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear. But she was pinned by his stare, a butterfly caught in a web of moonlight and power. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed against her cheek. A jolt, like fire, shot through her. It wasn't painful. It was alive. Something inside her, something she thought long dead and buried, shifted, stirred. Without another word, he spoke. His voice was a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the very stones beneath her feet, a sound meant not just for her, but for every single soul in that hall. Mine.
The space between them burned. He saw the terror in her wide, beautiful eyes. He saw her flinch from his touch, a movement that sent a sharp, protective pang through his chest. She smelled of fear, yes, but beneath it was that scent of moonlight and ash. His mate. She didn't know it yet. She couldn't feel the bond the way he could. He didn't know what scared her more, his presence or his touch. But deep down, he knew the truth. The world had hurt her. It had tried to break her. And his wolf rose within him, a possessive, furious beast, ready to tear apart anyone who had ever caused her a moment of pain. Her trembling nearly broke him. He had to get her out of there, away from these prying, judging eyes. The moment their eyes locked, he made a vow. Silent and absolute. He would protect her. He would cherish her. He would burn the world to the ground for her. The tension broke when her name left his lips, a question he already knew the answer to. But he had to hear her voice. "What is your name?" Her voice trembled, a whisper of sound. Nora. Nora. Her name hung in the air, a perfect, beautiful thing. And in the quiet that followed, he made his decision. Without taking his eyes off her, he raised his voice once more, the command of the Alpha King ringing with absolute finality. "She is my mate. We are leaving." And just like that, everything changed.
The words hit her like a physical blow. His mate. It didn't make sense. The world tilted on its axis, spinning into a blur of impossible sound and light. Before she could process it, before she could even form a protest, his arm was around her waist. It wasn't rough. It was firm, possessive, a band of steel and warmth that lifted her from her feet. He was moving, turning, leading her away from the shadows and into the shocked, silent heart of the hall. She was being swept away, a leaf in a hurricane. Her old life, her world of gray floors and cruel laughter, was vanishing behind her with every step he took. Her new immediate goal was simply to breathe, to survive. She looked back, just for a second, and saw the faces of her pack. Kale, Lyra, the Alpha. Their mouths were hanging open, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like fear. That was the last thing she saw before the great oak doors closed behind them, shutting out her past forever. The world was a blur of whipping wind and dark trees, and him. His arm was a band of iron around her waist, holding her secure against his side as his guards, immense, silent wolves in human form, led them through the night. The journey was a long, terrifying dream, and she was a ghost floating through it all. Because of that, she couldn't quite believe any of it was real. His mate. The words were a lie, a cruel, impossible joke. And then, the blur resolved into a breathtaking, terrifying reality, Silvermoon Keep. It wasn't a castle. It was a crown of silver and shadow forged into the side of a mountain. Towers like daggers scraped the belly of the moon, and windows glowed like 1,000 captured stars. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and it was the most frightening. As they swept through the gates, she felt it, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. Courtiers in silks and velvets stopped and stared. Their whispers followed her like snakes rustling in the grass. She was a ghost in her old home, but here she was a spectacle, a flaw, a smudge of dirt on a canvas of pure silver. A guard led her down a wide, echoing hall, the walls lined with ancient tapestries of great wolf hunts and epic battles. Eventually, they stopped before a set of carved wooden doors. He pushed them open, and her breath caught. The room was bigger than the entire hovel she'd shared with 3 other Omegas. A fire danced in a stone hearth. A massive bed was draped in furs and deep blue silk, the color of a twilight sky, the color her mother had promised her. Her chest ached. This was all a mistake. She didn't belong here. Without warning, the doors opened again. A she-wolf stood there, a vision of deadly grace. She was tall, with hair like spun silver and eyes the color of a winter frost. Her gown was the color of blood, and she wore her power like a second skin. The she-wolf glided into the room, her smile a perfect, sharp curve. "So, you are the one," she said, her voice smooth as polished ice. "I am Lady Seraphina, the king's closest advisor." The pause was a weapon. "We are all so surprised to welcome you."
He watched her from the far end of the hall. He saw the terror in her eyes as she took in the scale of his home. He saw her flinch from the whispers of the court. And a low, protective growl rumbled in his chest, a beast stirring in its cage. He felt their judgment not on him, they wouldn't dare, but on her. And that was an offense he would not tolerate. His goal was simple: get her to the safety of her chambers. Let her breathe. But then, his beta, Lycan, materialized at his side. My king. The council is demanding an audience. They are concerned. Let them be concerned, Draven bit out, his eyes still locked on Nora's retreating form. Draven, Lycan's voice was low, urgent. This is not a request. They speak of precedent, of the law, of choosing an undocumented Omega. Draven's jaw tightened. He knew what they were doing. They were testing him, pushing him. To make things worse, they were doing it now, when his focus was entirely on his mate. He tore his gaze away from her. Fine, tell them I will be there. As a result, he had to leave her alone. He had to walk into a room of political wolves and defend the truth of a bond they could never understand. He turned to go, but then he saw her, Seraphina, slipping into Nora's chambers like a silver viper. Deep down, he knew the truth. That woman was more dangerous than any assassin. Her smile was a sheath for a blade, and her courtesy was a poison. But his hands were tied. He was a king. And this was his court, a battlefield where the first casualty was always trust. The moment their eyes locked across the hall, a silent promise passed between them, a challenge. And he knew with a chilling certainty that the real war had just begun.
That night, the grand dining hall felt like a stage, and she was the terrified, unprepared actress thrust into the spotlight. The clinking of silver against porcelain was deafening. The scent of spiced wine and roasted fowl was so rich, it made her stomach clench with anxiety. Draven sat at the head of the long, polished table, a king carved from stone and shadow. She sat at his right hand, feeling like a field mouse beside a lion. Her goal was to be a statue, to not speak, to not move, to not spill anything, to not give them any more reasons to laugh at her. But then, Seraphina, seated opposite her, leaned forward, her icy eyes sparkling with feigned concern. "You must be quite overwhelmed, dear," she said, her voice carrying across the table. "The customs here can be so complex. For instance, that fork is for the salad." She smiled, a gesture of pure venom disguised as help, as several nobles glanced at the fork in Nora's hand and then exchanged subtle, knowing smirks. Heat flooded Nora's cheeks. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Moments later, Seraphina struck again. "Tell us, Nora. Your pack, the Blackwood. They are known for their fierce warriors, are they not? It is strange we have not heard of a she-wolf of your unique qualities from them before." The air thickened. The question hung there, a baited hook. She was asking about Nora's power, her rank, her wolf. She was asking her to admit, in front of this entire court of powerful, perfect beings, that she was a blank. The silence roared. Her breath caught. All she could do was stare down at her plate, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt Draven's entire body go rigid beside her. The space between them burned with his silent, helpless fury. She had failed. In her very first test as his mate, she had failed. She was embarrassing him. She was proving them all right.
He watched it happen, and it was like swallowing broken glass. He saw the subtle, masterful cruelty in Seraphina's every word, every gesture. He saw the calculated way she isolated Nora, highlighted her otherness, and then moved in for the kill with that damnable question. And rage, pure and absolute, coiled in his gut. His wolf clawed at the inside of his skin, screaming to be let out, to tear the smug, serene mask from Seraphina's face, to silence the whispers and the snickers with a single blood-chilling snarl. But he couldn't. He was the king, and this was the game. To lash out here in this public setting would be to show weakness. It would be an emotional outburst, not the act of a controlled alpha. It would give them power over him. It would prove their point that this mate, this beautiful, terrified girl, had made him unstable. So, he did the only thing he could. Without thinking, his hand found hers under the table. Her fingers were ice-cold, trembling. He gave them a firm, reassuring squeeze, a silent message. "I am here. I have you." Then, he turned his head, his golden eyes sweeping the table with a cold fire that made every lesser wolf flinch. "Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice deceptively calm, a low rumble that promised violence. "I believe my mate's history is a matter for myself, and not for courtly gossip. We were discussing the grain shipments from the north, were we not, Lord Valerius?" He had deflected. He had protected her. But it wasn't enough. He had seen the look in Nora's eyes, the deep, shattering shame, the confirmation of every fear she had ever held. That's why the moment the excruciating dinner was over, he gripped her arm and guided her from the hall, his movements swift and urgent. He led her into the cool, moonlit air of a private balcony, the sounds of the court fading behind them. She wouldn't look at him. She just stared out at the dark mountains, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Nora." She flinched at the sound of her name. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice softer now, but no less firm. Slowly she turned. The moonlight traced the tears glistening on her cheeks. And in the stillness that followed, he knew he had to breach the wall between them. He had to make her understand. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low, intense growl. "You will not listen to them. You will not believe their lies. Seraphina is a snake. This court is a pit of them." He stepped closer, his scent enveloping her. "You trust no one here. Do you understand me? No one, except for me." Her world tilted as she looked up into his blazing golden eyes, and for the first time, she saw past the king. She saw the wolf, and something inside her, something wild and broken and desperately lonely, answered.
His words on the balcony were a shield. Trust no one here, except for me. They echoed in her mind, a strange, terrifying comfort. But then, a new thought, sharp and insistent, pierced through her fear. A shield wasn't enough. She couldn't just hide behind him forever. Because of that, she knew she had to understand the world she'd been thrown into. She had to understand the rules of this beautiful, deadly game. The next day, she found her courage. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but it was there. She made her way to the heart of the keep, the great library. The air inside smelled of old paper and leather and secrets. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust like tiny, golden spirits. For the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of peace. Her goal was simple, to find a book on the history of the royal line, to learn something, anything. She was running her fingers over the spine of a heavy leather-bound tome when a voice, smooth as silk and cold as a tomb, spoke from behind her. "Lost, little Omega?" Nora jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Lady Seraphina stood there, an unreadable smile playing on her lips. She looked like a goddess of winter, beautiful and utterly without warmth. I was just looking," Nora stammered, feeling like a child caught stealing. "Of course you were," Seraphina purred, gliding closer. "It is all so much to take in. Perhaps I can help you find something more appropriate for your situation." Before Nora could protest, Seraphina's long, elegant fingers plucked a slender, dark red book from a higher shelf. She held it out to Nora. The title was embossed in faded gold leaf. The Broken Bond, a study on the fate of defective mates. The air rushed from Nora's lungs. The words were a physical blow, a confirmation of every vile thing she believed about herself. Defective.
At the same time, Draven stood before his war council, the air in the chamber thick with tension. Lord Valerius, an old wolf with eyes like chips of slate, was speaking. "And the old laws are quite clear, my king. A mate to the alpha of alphas must be of proven lineage. Her wolf must be strong. It is for the security of the bloodline." Draven's hands clenched into fists at his side. He kept his voice level, a low, dangerous rumble. "My mate's strength is not a matter for debate. The bond chose her. That is the only law that matters. A bond can be mistaken," another lord dared to mutter. Draven's head snapped towards him, his golden eyes blazing with a fire that made the old wolf shrink back in his seat. "My bond is not mistaken." The argument raged on, a pointless, infuriating circle. He was the king, yet he had to entertain their challenges. He had to play the game. But as they spoke, a strange, cold unease began to creep up his spine, a prickling sensation. It was the bond. A tremor of distress, faint but sharp, vibrated along the golden thread that connected him to her. Something was wrong. He cut Valerius off mid-sentence. This council is over. Without another word, he turned and stalked from the chamber, his mind racing. What had happened? Where was she? The feeling grew stronger with every step he took, a cold wave of despair and fear that was not his own. It was a silent scream, and his soul answered. He found her in the hallway, fleeing the library. She was clutching a red book to her chest like a mortal wound. She didn't see him. Her eyes were wide with a shattered, haunted look that made his wolf roar with a rage so profound it shook his bones. She was breaking. Someone was breaking her, and he knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as the moon's pull on the tides, who was responsible.
She made it to her chambers, the heavy doors closing behind her with a sound of finality. She leaned against the wood, her body trembling. Defective. The word was branded on her mind. The book fell from her numb fingers, landing on the plush carpet with a soft, sickening thud. The beautiful room was a cage. The silks and furs were a mockery. She was a broken thing dressed in a queen's finery, and sooner or later, everyone would see the truth. Draven would see the truth, and he would cast her aside. The thought was an agony so sharp it stole her breath. She didn't know what scared her more, the court's hatred, or the thought of his eventual rejection. Without warning, a shadow detached itself from the heavy velvet curtains by the window. Her heart stopped. It was a man dressed in black from head to toe, a mask covering his face. He moved with a liquid silence that was utterly unnatural. In one hand, he held a dagger, its edge gleaming with a faint, oily poison. Before she could scream, before she could even draw a breath to try, he was on her. A cold, hard hand clamped over her mouth. An arm like a band of steel wrapped around her, pinning her arms to her sides. And then she felt it. The icy, razor-thin kiss of the blade against her throat. Terror, pure, white-hot, and absolute, flooded her. This was it. This was how she died. Not with a wolf's howl, but in silence. A blank, fading to black.
He was halfway down the corridor when it hit him. Not a whisper, not a sound. It was a silent, psychic scream of pure terror that ripped through the mate bond. It was his own soul being torn in two. Nora! The door to her chamber didn't open. It exploded inward, splintering into 1,000 pieces as he slammed his body through it. And what he saw sent a wave of primal, murderous rage through him that was so powerful, it turned his vision red. A masked coward. A blade at her throat. The scent of her terror so thick it was a poison in the air. The assassin's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock behind the mask. He was fast. He was a professional, but he wasn't a king. He wasn't a mate. Draven didn't roar. He didn't shout. The sound that ripped from his chest was something older, something more terrifying. It was the sound of a predator whose most sacred thing was being threatened. In the span of a breath, he crossed the room. The assassin tried to use Nora as a shield, to deepen the cut of the blade. But Draven was faster. His hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist. The crack of bone was like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The dagger clattered to the floor. The assassin let out a choked gasp of pain. Draven didn't hesitate. His other hand shot to the man's throat. There was no fight. There was no struggle. There was only the swift, brutal, and absolute finality of the Alpha King. A sharp twist. A final, sickening snap. The body fell to the floor, a broken puppet. And in the quiet that followed, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the sight of Nora, pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with shock, a thin crimson line welling up on the perfect skin of her throat. The rage vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, gut-wrenching terror so profound it made him feel sick. He had almost been too late. A second, a single heartbeat of a second, and he would have lost her. The world narrowed to that single terrifying thought. He took a step towards her, his hands raised. Nora! She flinched. The small, instinctive movement was like a knife in his heart. Of course, she was afraid. She had just seen him kill a man with his bare hands. She had seen the monster. His goal was singular: to get to her, to make sure she was okay, to hold her until the world stopped shaking for both of them. He forced his voice to be gentle. "Are you hurt? Let me see." He reached for her and she didn't pull away. His fingers, still trembling with the aftershocks of his rage, gently tilted her chin up. The cut was shallow, a scratch. But it was a promise of what could have been, and the sight of her blood on her skin made his wolf want to tear the room apart. But then, her eyes, wide and dazed, focused on him, not his face, but his arm. A thin cut, long and shallow, ran along his forearm where the assassin's blade must have grazed him.
Her thoughts spun in a fog of terror and shock. The dead man on the floor, the splintered door, Draven's eyes, which had burned with a light so fierce it was barely sane. But then, through the haze, she saw it. The red line on his arm. He was hurt. He had been hurt. For her. Her body moved on instinct. Without thinking, she reached out, and her fingers brushed against the cut. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her own voice sounding strange and distant. She turned and tore a strip from the silk sheet on the bed. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. But she managed. She gently, clumsily, wrapped the strip of blue silk around his powerful forearm, her small hands against his hard, warm skin. The silence stretched, filled only with the sound of their breathing. The moment their eyes locked, something shifted. Her fear was still there, a humming beneath her skin, but something else was rising to meet it. He had saved her. He had felt her terror. "How?" she began, her voice trembling. "How did you know?" He looked down at her hands, still resting on his arm. His voice was a low, raw thing, stripped of all its royal command. "The bond. Nora, I didn't hear you. I felt it. I felt your fear as if it were my own." Her breath caught. It was real. This impossible connection. It was real. He gently covered her hands with his own, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. The touch was electric. "He won't be the last," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "They tried to break your spirit in the library. When that didn't work, they sent him." He looked up, and the monster was back in his eyes. But this time, it wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at the world. "This changes things," he growled, the sound vibrating through her hands into her very bones. He stepped closer, his scent, that wild, storm-swept forest, enveloping her completely. "I will find every single person responsible for this, and I will burn this entire kingdom to ash before I let anyone harm you again." And in the stillness that followed, she looked up at him, at her protector, her captor, her fated mate, and for the first time in her entire life, she believed him. She wasn't just his property to be claimed. She was his to protect. And as the truth unraveled, something inside her, something that had been dormant and broken for a lifetime, finally, truly, began to wake up. The dead assassin was gone. The splintered door had been replaced. But the ghost of his presence, and the memory of Draven's lethal fury, remained. In the quiet of her chambers, Nora stared at the dark red book still lying on the floor. The Broken Bond, a study on the fate of defective mates. Her old self, the girl from the Blackwood Pack, would have hidden it, burned it, pretended it didn't exist. But that girl was gone, wasn't she? Something new, something forged in terror and tempered by a king's vow was taking her place. She knelt, her fingers trembling as they traced the faded gold letters. Her goal was no longer just to survive. It was to understand. Because knowledge was a weapon, and she was done being unarmed. With a deep, shuddering breath, she picked up the book. It felt heavy in her hands, a weight of history and judgment. She sat in a chair by the fire, the silk of her gown feeling like a costume she hadn't yet earned. And then she opened it to the first page. The words were dry, academic, and utterly cruel. They spoke of genetic flaws, of spiritual voids, of omegas whose wolves failed to manifest, forever marking them as incomplete, unable to properly accept the soul of a mate's bond. Every sentence was a confirmation of her deepest fears. Yet, she kept reading. She forced herself to absorb every painful word. Because if she was going to fight this, she had to know the name of her enemy, even if that enemy was her own broken self.
At the same time, in the cold, damp dungeons beneath the keep, the air was thick with the smell of blood and fear. The assassin's body lay on a stone slab. Draven stood over it, his face a mask of cold fury. Lycan was beside him, his expression grim. "They were professionals, my king," Lycan reported, his voice a low rumble. "No pack markings, no identifying tattoos." "No," Draven said, his voice flat and deadly. "But they were sloppy." He pointed to a small, almost invisible sigil stitched into the man's leather glove, a coiled serpent eating its own tail. "House Morvayn, they've been Seraphina's staunchest allies for a generation." He turned to Lycan, his golden eyes burning with an unholy light. The time for politics was over. The time for subtlety was a luxury he could no longer afford. Because of that, he knew he had to send a message that would echo through the entire kingdom. "I want every member of that house in this dungeon by sunrise," Draven commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The guards, the servants, the nobles, everyone. And I want the name of the one who paid them." Lycan's eyes widened slightly. "Draven, that is an act of war against a noble house. They declared war when they put a blade to my mate's throat." Draven snarled, the sound ripping through the silence. "This is not a negotiation. It is a purge. Find me a name, Lycan, or I will start taking them apart piece by piece myself." Without another word, he turned and swept from the dungeon, leaving Lycan to carry out the brutal order. His path was set. He was no longer just a king defending his throne. He was a wolf defending his mate, and his fangs were finally truly bared.
For 2 days, she read. She devoured the cruel academic text, her mind absorbing the history of her own perceived failure. The book detailed dozens of cases throughout history, of mates who went mad, of bonds that withered and died, of alphas who were forced to cast aside their defective mates to preserve their own sanity and power. With every page, the fragile hope in her chest shriveled. Maybe Seraphina was right. Maybe she was a curse. She was about to close the book, to surrender to the despair, when her eyes caught on a footnote at the bottom of a page. The ink was faded, the script small and cramped, an academic afterthought. See also Appendix C, Debunked Myths, Extinct Bloodlines. Note the disputed theory of elemental latency, a rare condition wherein a wolf's manifestation is merely dormant, not absent, awaiting a catalyst of extreme duress. Such cases, though largely apocryphal, were often associated with elemental affinities. Latency. Dormant. The words were a spark in the suffocating darkness. A possibility. A question. What if she wasn't empty? What if she was just waiting? The thought was so wild, so audacious it made her feel dizzy. She felt it, clear as day. A flicker of something deep inside her, like a pilot light finally catching gas. Just like that, the doors to her chamber opened. It was Draven. The fury was gone from his face, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. He strode towards her, his eyes locking on the red book in her lap. "Still reading that poison?" he asked, his voice low. "I had to know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to understand what they think I am." "I know what you are," he said, his voice softening as he knelt before her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, solid. "You are mine." He paused, and his golden eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "And I have a name, the man who hired the assassin, a captain of House Morvayn. He confessed before he died." Her breath caught. And? Draven's lips curved into a feral smile that was both terrifying and breathtaking. He was paid by a fund controlled directly by Lord Theron, Seraphina's father. Her father. The connection was made. The web was becoming clear. As the silence stretched, She looked at him. Really looked at him. He wasn't just telling her this to inform her. He was including her. He was treating her not as a fragile thing to be protected, but as his partner in this war. Her world tilted. In sharing this victory, this piece of the puzzle, he was giving her something more precious than any crown. He was giving her his trust.
He saw the change in her eyes. The flicker of fear was still there, but it was being replaced by a glimmer of steel. He had come here to give her news, to give her the reassurance that he was hunting down her enemies. But as he looked at her, he realized she didn't just want reassurance. She wanted to be part of the hunt. And his wolf purred in approval. She was a queen. His queen. As if summoned by his thoughts, a soft knock came at the door. A servant girl entered, her head bowed low. She carried a silver tray with a single steaming cup of herbal tea. "A gift, your majesties," the girl mumbled, her eyes fixed on the floor. "From an anonymous well-wisher for the Lady Nora's nerves." Draven's eyes narrowed. "Anonymous?" "Yes, my king." He waved a hand in dismissal, his gaze never leaving Nora's face. The girl placed the tray on a small table and scurried out. The scent of the tea filled the room. Chamomile and something else. Something faintly, cloyingly sweet. Something that made the hairs on his arm stand up. But Nora looked at the cup, and then at him, a small, hopeful smile gracing her lips for the first time. Maybe not everyone here hates me," she whispered. His heart ached. He wanted to believe it for her. He wanted her to have that small comfort. So he just nodded, his own instincts screaming at him that in this court, anonymous gifts were never, ever kind. And she, his beautiful, trusting mate, picked up the cup.
The tea was warm and soothing. It tasted of honey and flowers, and she drank it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her limbs and chasing away the last of the day's chill. For a few hours, she felt normal. She and Draven spoke, not of assassins and conspiracies, but of small things. He told her a story about learning to track with his father in the northern forests. She, in turn, told him about her mother's lavender garden. Between them, something cracked open, a space for gentleness, for a future she hadn't dared to imagine. But then, it began. A subtle coldness seeping into her bones, a faint, dizzying lightness in her head. She tried to ignore it. It was probably just exhaustion, the emotional toll of the past few days. Her goal was to be strong, to not show him any weakness. Not now, when they were finally connecting. She stood up to add a log to the fire, but a wave of vertigo so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. The room spun. The floor seemed to rush up to meet her. She put a hand out to steady herself against the stone mantelpiece, her knuckles white. "Nora?" Draven's voice was sharp with sudden concern. I'm fine," she lied, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. Just tired. But she wasn't fine. The cold was deeper now, a profound, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Her heart was beating too slowly, a sluggish, heavy thump in her chest. Deep down, she knew the truth. Something was terribly wrong.
He knew she was lying. He had been watching her, his heightened senses on full alert. Her scent, it was changing. The beautiful, vibrant scent of moonlight and ash was being muted, veiled by that same faint, cloying sweetness from the tea. A scent of decay. A scent of poison. His blood ran cold. He was across the room in a second, his hands on her arms, steadying her. Her skin was like ice. "You are not fine," he growled, his voice rough with a rising tide of panic. "You are freezing." He swept her up into his arms. She felt terrifyingly light, as fragile as a bird, and carried her to the bed. He piled furs on top of her, but he knew it was useless. This was not a normal chill. This was magical. A curse. A slow poison designed not just to kill, but to mimic a natural weakness, to make her seem defective. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Seraphina. This had her name written all over it. An assassin had failed, so she had resorted to a woman's weapon. A poison the healers wouldn't recognize. A poison that would make Nora fade away, proving to the entire world that the blank was simply too weak to carry the king's bond. His rage was a white-hot, silent inferno. He was a king. He had just torn a noble house apart with a single command. But as he looked down at Nora, her face pale, her breathing shallow, a terrifying, gut-wrenching helplessness washed over him. He could kill his enemies, but he couldn't fight a poison that was already in her veins. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with confusion and fear. "Draven, what's happening to me?" He gathered her close, his arms wrapping around her, trying to pour his own strength, his own warmth into her. But she was still so cold. And as he held his mate, feeling her life force slowly, insidiously draining away, the all-powerful Alpha King had never felt so utterly, completely powerless.
The world became a soft, cold fog. Days and nights blurred into a meaningless gray haze, each one a little colder, a little dimmer than the last. The royal healers came and went, their faces tight with confusion. They poked and prodded, muttering about pack sickness and shock. But Nora knew. Deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't a sickness. It was a hollowing out. It was the poison of her own brokenness, finally consuming her from the inside. The book hadn't been a threat. It had been a prophecy. Defective. Draven was a constant, burning presence at her side. He held her hand, his warmth a stark contrast to the ice in her veins. He tried to feed her broth, his voice a low, desperate rumble, begging her to eat. But with every touch, with every worried glance from his molten gold eyes, a terrible, agonizing guilt grew in her heart. She was killing him. Not with a blade or a poison, but with her own weakness. His power, his very life force, was being poured into the black hole of the bond they shared. A bond she was too flawed to properly hold. His strength was being spent on her, and it was doing nothing. She could feel it. She was a leak in the soul of his ship, and she was sinking him with her. Because of that, she began to pull away. When he reached for her hand, she would shift, just out of reach. When he spoke, she would pretend to be asleep. Her goal was no longer to get better. It was to sever. To cut the cord before she dragged him down into the cold darkness with her.
Rage. It was a constant, silent inferno in his gut. A rage so profound it had no sound. He watched her fade, a beautiful, vibrant flame being slowly, deliberately starved of air. And he was helpless. He was the Alpha King. He had leveled a noble house with a word. Yet he could not stop the poison that was stealing the light from his mate's eyes. The healers were useless. Their ignorance was a weapon in his enemy's hands. Soon after their failed attempts, the whispers started, just as he knew they would. They slithered through the court like smoke under a door. The bond is too strong for her. An Omega body can't handle an Alpha King's power. It's killing her. He's killing her with his love. He heard it all. Every venomous word was a new crack in his already fractured control. This was Seraphina's masterpiece. A perfect, bloodless assassination. She was murdering Nora with public opinion, using the court's own prejudice as the blade. That night he sat by Nora's bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was so pale, so still. The vibrant scent of moonlight and ash was almost gone, buried under the sweet, sickly smell of the wolfsbane poison. He remembered the night his parents died, the uselessness, the horror of watching the life drain from the ones he loved. And now, it was happening again. His past was a ghost, its cold hands wrapped around his throat. He had failed them, and now he was failing her. The thought was an agony that dwarfed all the rage, leaving behind a cold, desolate emptiness. As if she felt his despair, her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, distant. "Draven," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I'm here," he said, his own voice raw. "I'm right here." She looked at him, and for a moment, a flicker of the old Nora was there, the gentle, resilient soul he had first seen in the shadows. "You should go," she breathed. You have a kingdom to run." The words were a dismissal, a gentle, loving rejection that was sharper than any blade. and the silence that followed was the sound of his heart breaking. Come morning, the final blow came. Not with a dagger, but with a scroll and a delegation. Lord Valerius, flanked by the other senior members of the council, stood before his throne. Their faces were masks of solemn, respectful concern. It was a lie. He could smell the vulture-like ambition on them. My king, Valerius began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. We come to you today not as your council, but as your loyal subjects who grieve with you. Draven said nothing. He simply stared, his eyes burning holes into the old wolf's face. Valerius unfurled the scroll. We have consulted the ancient laws. We have spoken with the healers. It is with the heaviest of hearts that we must present this petition. He took a deep breath. For the sake of the Lady Nora's life, and for the stability of the kingdom, we formally request that you set her aside. Annul the bond before it consumes her completely. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war disguised as a plea for mercy. To make things worse, Seraphina stood just behind them, her silver eyes filled with a perfect imitation sorrow. She was a predator, watching her trap snap shut. He was cornered, checkmated. If he refused, he was a monster. A selfish tyrant willing to let his mate die for his own possessive needs, proving he was unfit to rule. If he agreed, he would be willingly severing his own soul and casting Nora out, likely to her death. They had left him no good options. They had used his love, his bond, as a weapon against him. His wolf clawed at his insides, screaming for blood. Kill them all. But he was a king, and his first duty was to the kingdom. What would his people think? Would they follow a king who let his heart rule his head, even to the point of destruction? His voice, when it came, was a low, chilling whisper. Get out. Valerius bowed low. Of course, my king. We will leave you to your consideration. They left him there, alone in the cavernous throne room, the scroll lying on the steps before him like a death sentence. The silence roared, filled with the ghosts of his parents and the impending loss of his mate. And for the first time in his life, Draven did not know what to do.
She heard the whispers. A serving girl, thinking she was asleep, had been gossiping with a guard outside her door. The council is with him now. They're going to make him give her up. It's for the best, for her own good. The words didn't hurt. They were just true. Of course, they wanted him to get rid of her. She was a disease, a weakness in the heart of their kingdom. She had been so foolish to think, even for a moment, that she could be a queen. She was a blank, and blanks were meant to be erased. A strange, cold peace settled over her. The fight was over. The hope that had flickered to life within her had finally been extinguished, leaving only a quiet, resigned emptiness. She wasn't just defective. She was dangerous. Her very existence was a threat to the man she loved him. The realization was a soft, sad thing. A final, painful truth. She loved him. And because she loved him, she had to save him. She had to save him from her. That night, she gathered the last of her strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When Draven came into the room, his face etched with a torment that tore her heart in two, she sat up. Draven, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He rushed to her side, his eyes wild with a desperate hope. Nora? Are you feeling better? Sit, she whispered. He did, taking her cold hands in his. The warmth of his touch was a sweet, familiar agony. She had to do this now before she lost her nerve. I know what the council asked of you today, she said softly. The hope in his eyes died, replaced by a flash of fury. You are not to worry about those vipers. I will handle them. No, she said, gently pulling her hands from his. The loss of his touch was like a physical wound, but she endured it. They're right. He stared at her, his expression uncomprehending. What? They're right, Draven, she repeated, her voice a quiet, unbreakable thing. Look at me. This bond. Our bond. It's killing me, and it's weakening you. I can feel it. She looked into his beautiful, tortured eyes. You are a king. You cannot be brought down by a flawed mate. You cannot let me destroy you. Never, he growled, his voice thick with pain. I will never let you go. You have to, she said, and a single hot tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. I want you to. I am releasing you. I am rejecting the bond.
The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. Rejecting the bond. It was a concept so alien, so fundamentally wrong, it felt like the sky was falling. He could feel it instantly, a cold, tearing sensation along the golden thread that connected their souls. It didn't break, but it frayed, weakened by her will, her despair. It was an agony beyond any physical pain he had ever known. No, he choked out, reaching for her. Nora, don't do this. That's what they want you to do. It's the poison talking, not you. It is me, she said, her voice filled with a terrible, calm certainty. She wouldn't look at him. This is the only way to save you. Please, just let me go. Let me fade away. It will be a mercy. His world shattered. It wasn't Seraphina's poison that was killing her. It wasn't the council's ambition. It was her own broken spirit. They had won. They had convinced her of the one lie that could truly destroy them both. That she was worthless. He saw it all in that moment. The assassin had failed. The poison was just a tool. The true weapon had always been her own heart, and now she was turning it on herself. And him. He was on his knees by her bed, his head bowed, his entire body shaking with a grief so profound it felt like death itself. He had failed, utterly. He had brought her here to protect her, and instead, he had led her to a slaughterhouse of the soul. He was the Alpha King, and he had lost. And in the cold, silent room, as his mate willingly let go of their bond, Draven was once again that small, helpless boy, watching everything he loved being destroyed right in front of him. He sat in the chair beside her bed, a king turned to stone, and watched her die. The bond between them was a raw, open wound. Her rejection hadn't severed it. It was worse. It had frayed it, leaving a tattered cord of agony that transmitted her fading life force and his own helpless despair in an endless, torturous loop. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He had refused to leave her side. To do so would be to surrender. And his wolf, his very soul, would not allow it. The council thought they were waiting for him to break. They didn't understand. He had already broken. This quiet, cold room was the site of his final, silent defeat. The world outside could burn for all he cared. But then he felt it. A flicker, a tiny, impossibly faint pull on the frayed edges of the bond. Not the passive draining he had grown used to, but an active, deliberate tug. It was weak, it was fragile, but it was there. His head snapped up. Her eyes were open. Not glassy and distant, but focused. On him. There was a desperate, feverish light in their depths he hadn't seen in days.
She had been floating in a cold gray sea, ready to let the current take her, ready to sink. But his pain, it was an anchor. It was a beacon. Her attempt to save him was a torment, a slow, agonizing death for his soul. She could feel his grief, his rage, his suffocating helplessness, and it was 1,000 times worse than the poison in her own veins. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had been a fool. She hadn't been saving him. She had been helping his enemies kill him. And in that moment of terrible clarity, the words from the book floated up from the depths of her memory, a single, desperate life raft. Latency. A wolf's manifestation is merely dormant, not absent, awaiting a catalyst of extreme duress. What if the duress wasn't a blade at her throat? What if the duress was this? The agony of a bond being willingly, wrongly rejected. What if she wasn't a broken vessel, but a locked one? The thought was a bolt of lightning in the fog. Her goal, in an instant, changed from dying with dignity to living with ferocity. She focused all of her remaining will, that tiny, stubborn ember that had refused to be extinguished, and she pulled. She reached for him across the shattered bridge of their bond, her soul screaming a single word: no. The effort was immense. It was like trying to lift a mountain. The cold in her veins intensified, a backlash of icy fire. But she didn't stop. She felt his attention snap to her. His golden eyes were wide, shocked. Her voice was a dry, cracking whisper, but it was the strongest sound in the entire world. "The book," she rasped, her throat raw. "The footnote. It said, dormant."
Dormant. The word was a key. It was a spark. It was hope, a thing he thought he would never feel again. He was on his feet in an instant, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch, afraid to break the spell. "What?" he breathed, his voice rough with disbelief. "Nora, what are you saying?" "Not broken," she whispered, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "Just locked. It needs a catalyst, extreme duress." His mind, his sharp, tactical king's mind, which had been fogged with grief, suddenly roared back to life. The pieces began to slam into place with breathtaking speed. The poison, the court's pressure, her rejection of the bond, it was all a perfect storm of duress. But it was uncontrolled. It was killing her before it could unlock her. "Then we control it," he said, the words coming fast, a plan forming from the ashes of his despair. "We don't stop it. We use it."
She saw the storm gathering in his eyes, the brilliant mind of the Alpha King seizing on her whisper of hope and forging it into a weapon. And she wasn't afraid. For the first time, she was a part of his fire. "They think I'm dying," she whispered, her own voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Let them." The moment their eyes locked, the plan was born between them, a silent, terrible, and beautiful thing. They didn't need to speak all the details. They both saw the shape of it, a performance, a trap, a final, desperate gamble that would either save them both or destroy them completely. He would pretend to break. He would give the council what they wanted. And she would let them think they had won. "I will call the court," Draven said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, his face already settling into a mask of grim tragedy. "I will tell them I am considering their petition. I will set a formal hearing for tomorrow night." "Seraphina will be there," Nora breathed, the name tasting like ash. "She will be at the front," Draven confirmed, his lips curling into a feral approximation of a smile. "She will not be able to resist watching her victory." He squeezed her hand, his touch no longer just comforting, but a promise, a pact. "And at the height of it," he continued, his voice dropping, "at the moment it seems all is lost, I will give you the final push. I will give you the catalyst." He meant he would reject her. Publicly, he would have to say the words, to put the force of his will behind an act that was a violation of his very soul. The pain would be immense for them both. It would be the ultimate duress, and it was their only chance. Her world tilted. The fear was real. The poison was real. But for the first time, so was the hope. She looked at him, her king, her mate, and she nodded. She spent the day in silence, gathering her strength. She did not fight the poison's chill. Instead, she observed it. She let it flow through her, learning its cold, slow rhythm. She focused on the bond, that tattered, beautiful cord between her and Draven. She practiced pulling on it, small, steady tugs, each one an act of defiance, an affirmation of her will to live. The pain was a constant, icy fire. But beneath it, she could feel it. That tiny, sleeping thing deep inside her. It wasn't stirring yet, but it was listening. As the sky darkened, 2 serving girls came to dress her. They moved with a sorrowful gentleness, as if they were preparing a body for a funeral. They chose a simple white gown, the color of surrender, the color of a sacrifice. It was perfect. When they were done, she looked in the mirror. She saw a pale, fragile creature, her eyes like dark, bruised pools in her gaunt face. She looked defeated. She looked like she was already gone. Good. The great bells of the keep began to toll, a a deep, mournful sound that echoed through the stone. It was time. The doors to her chamber opened. Lycan stood there, his weathered face an unreadable mask, but his eyes held a flicker of something. A question. A sliver of hope. He offered her his arm. "My lady," he rumbled. She took it. Her steps were slow, deliberately weak, as he escorted her on the long, final walk to the throne room, to her own execution, or her coronation. She entered the great hall. It was packed. Every noble, every courtier, every captain of the guard was there. They parted before her like a grim, silent sea. At the far end of the hall, on his massive, carved throne, sat Draven. His face was like stone, his golden eyes holding an agony so profound it was almost her undoing. And at the foot of the throne, looking up at him with an expression of perfect, triumphant sorrow, was Lady Seraphina. The trap was set. The players were in place, and Nora, the defective mate, walked toward the center of it all, her heart a steady, terrifying drumbeat, ready for the end to begin. She walked toward the throne, and every step was a lifetime. The vast hall was a cavern of hostile silence, the air thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and a faint, coppery tang of fear. Hundreds of eyes followed her, a physical weight that tried to press her into the cold marble floor. But she was no longer a ghost. She was a fuse, burning slowly, deliberately, toward the flame. As she reached the center of the room, she sank to her knees, a perfect picture of a weak, dying Omega offering herself up for judgment. Lord Valerius stepped forward, his face a mask of solemn duty. He unrolled a scroll, the crackle of the parchment like the sound of dry bones breaking. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice echoing in the unnerving quiet, "to address a matter of grave importance to the stability of the kingdom and the health of our king." He droned on, citing ancient laws, speaking of flawed bloodlines and broken bonds. Each word was a perfectly sharpened stone, meant to kill her spirit before her body gave out. The poison in her veins was a familiar, icy river, but beneath it, that tiny, sleeping thing, it was listening.
He watched her from his throne, and it was the most difficult performance of his life. He had to let them speak. He had to let them wound her with their words. He had to sit there, a king of stone and sorrow, while his soul screamed to leap from the throne and tear them all to pieces. Because their arrogance, their certainty, was a crucial part of the trap. He had to make it look real, because their lives depended on it. He saw the triumphant, pitying look in Seraphina's eyes. She was savoring this, drinking in his apparent despair like the finest wine. She thought she was watching the final act of her masterpiece. She had no idea she was standing at the heart of an inferno. Finally, Valerius finished. He rolled up the scroll. "And so, with the heaviest of hearts, we ask you, my king, for her sake, and for yours, will you set her aside?" The entire court held its breath. Draven rose slowly from his throne, his movements heavy with a grief that felt terrifyingly real. He looked down at Nora, at her pale, fragile form. He drew upon every ounce of his pain, his fear, his desperation, and he let it flood his voice. "The bond between a mate is sacred," he began, his voice a raw, broken thing that echoed with loss. "But no bond should demand a life." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He felt the bond scream in agony at the lie he was about to tell. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I, Draven, king of all alphas, reject this bond."
The word reject was not a word. It was a physical blow, a sledgehammer of pure agony that slammed into her soul. The frayed cord of their bond didn't just tear, it shredded. The pain was absolute, a white-hot nova of pure, undiluted suffering that dwarfed the poison, the fear, everything, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. Because in that moment of ultimate duress, the final lock shattered. It was not a breaking, it was a shattering, like a geode cracked open to reveal a universe of crystal fire. The icy poison in her veins did not retreat. It was incinerated. A wave of impossible heat bloomed in her chest, a furnace of pure, silver light. It was the warmth of the sun, the light of the moon, the heart of a star. Her body arched off the floor, a silent scream of rebirth tearing from her lips. The air thickened. Time stood still. The white gown she wore began to smoke at the edges. Silver flames, cool and bright as moonlight, danced along her skin, not burning, but cleansing. Her vision sharpened, the world exploding into a spectrum of colors she had never known existed. She could smell the individual sweat of fear on every noble, hear the frantic, terrified flutter of their hearts, and her wolf. It did not rise. It did not emerge. It simply was. It was her. And she was it. Whole. Complete. She rose to her feet, no longer a pale, dying thing, but a column of silver fire. Her eyes, when she opened them, were no longer the soft, gentle brown of Nora the Blank. They were blazing pools of liquid moonlight. The entire court fell back, gasping in terror and awe. Impossible! Seraphina breathed, her perfect mask of sorrow cracking to reveal the raw, ugly shock beneath. She took a step back, her hand flying to a hidden dagger at her waist. "You're nothing! A blank!" "I was never empty," Nora said, and her voice was no longer a whisper. It was a melody of power, a song of fire and ice. "I was just full of something else." As if fate demanded it, Seraphina lunged, the poisoned dagger a blur of steel aimed at Nora's heart. Nora didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply raised a hand, and a wall of pure silver flame erupted from the floor between them, stopping the blade an inch from its goal. The dagger melted into slag, dripping to the floor with a final, defeated hiss. Seraphina stared, her face a mask of horror, at the impossible, beautiful, terrifying Queen of Fire who stood before her.
In the quiet that followed, he could only stare. The sight of her? It was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The bond between them was no longer a frayed cord of agony. It was a blazing sun, a river of pure, joyful power that flooded his soul. She wasn't just his mate. She was magnificent. His wolf howled in triumph within him, a song of pure, unadulterated pride. He descended the steps of the throne, his eyes never leaving her. The court was frozen, a tableau of terror and disbelief. He stopped beside her, a king standing beside his queen. He looked at Seraphina, who was trembling, her face pale with the reality of her utter defeat. Then he looked at Lord Valerius, who seemed to have aged 50 years in a minute. "Treason," Draven said, his voice calm but carrying the deadly weight of a glacier, "is a crime I do not forgive." He turned to Lycan, who was already moving forward, his face a grim mask of satisfaction. "Take her, and take the entire council. Their trial will be swift. Their sentence will be a warning to all who would ever threaten my queen again." As the guards dragged the conspirators away, their pleas for mercy echoing in the suddenly vast hall, Draven turned back to Nora. The silver flames had receded, but the light remained, a soft, ethereal glow in her eyes.
She felt the power settle within her, no longer a raging inferno, but a calm, steady inner warmth. The cold was gone forever. She looked at the faces in the court, the ones who had mocked her, scorned her, called her blank, and she saw no triumph in their fear, only a quiet, final certainty of who she was. A wave of exhaustion, deep and profound, washed over her. The adrenaline of the transformation was fading, leaving a bone-deep weariness behind. She swayed on her feet. Instantly, Draven's arm was around her, solid and sure. He held her, not like a fragile thing to be protected, but like an equal to be supported. "I have you," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "I know," she breathed, leaning against him, her head resting on his chest. She could hear the strong, steady beat of his heart, the greatest song in the world. Without another word, he swept her up into his arms. He turned and carried her from the throne room, leaving the stunned, silent remnants of his court behind. He walked not as a king carrying his prize, but as a wolf carrying his mate home. And just like that, everything changed. For good. That night, she stood before the mirror in their chambers. The door was whole. The air was warm. And the woman staring back at her was a stranger. Her eyes still held the faint, silver luminescence. Her skin seemed to glow from within. But the change was deeper. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. In their place was a quiet, unshakable strength. She could feel her wolf, a calm, powerful presence perfectly intertwined with her own soul. She was finally, completely, herself. The doors opened and Draven entered. He stopped, his breath catching as he looked at her. He had shed his heavy royal leathers and wore only simple black trousers, his powerful chest bare. He came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her waist. They looked at their reflections together in the mirror. A king of shadow and a queen of moonlight. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper against her ear. He could finally admit it now, because the threat was truly over. "You could never lose me," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Even when I tried to let you go."
He looked down into her luminous eyes, and his heart, which had been a fortress of ice for so long, finally, completely, melted. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. A whisper of a touch. "Forgive me," he murmured against her mouth. "For what I had to say. In the hall." "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered back, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You were giving me the key." The space between them burned, not with tension or fear, but with a love so profound it was a physical force. He deepened the kiss, and it was not the kiss of a king claiming his queen. It was a kiss of equals, a kiss of survivors, a kiss of two halves of a single soul, finally reunited, finally whole. It was a promise of 1,000 sunrises, of a shared throne, of a love that had been forged in fire and would now last for an eternity. Later, he led her to the balcony, the same one where he had first made his vow to protect her. The night was clear, the stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. They stood together, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the vast, moon-silvered kingdom that stretched before them. It was no longer just his kingdom to rule, it was theirs. "My queen," he murmured, his lips against her hair. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, her inner fire a perfect, steady warmth against the cool night air. "My king," she answered. This was not an ending, and she let it happen. It was the beginning.